If you, the viewer, were injected with a strange serum that turned you invisible, but the scientists trap you inside a secret lab, would you know how to escape? In this video, I'm going to be placing you in the shoes of the Hollowman and fix the mistakes he makes in the movie to ultimately ensure that the villain finally wins. Now, before we get started with anything, let's go over quickly the plot of the movie for anyone that hasn't seen the movie or hasn't watched the movie in a really long time, because after all, this movie wasn't amazing, so it's not super memorable, and it's also very old. Our movie starts off following Dr. Sebastian Cain, who is a cocky, asshole, but very intelligent scientist. Sebastian Cain is the head of a research team working on creating a serum that can turn things, animals, humans, invisible. And it turns out that they're actually successful in turning a few animals invisible. Here we learn the weakness of the stuff that's invisible, and they can be seen through infrared goggles. One of the monkeys bites the scientist and escapes, and it seems this lab is very equipped for the situation, because right on the wall, where the fire extinguishers are at, there's infrared goggles and tranquilizer darts. After catching the gorilla, they do a few experiments and inject him with the counter serum, which turns him back to being visible. Dr. Cain, really excited with his research finally being successful, brings his entire team to dinner for some team bonding experiment, and I think this is really good for the villain, because what you want to do is trick these people to thinking you actually give a shit about them. Dr. Cain then goes to the government, where he tells the government his experiment still needs more time. Why? Because he says fuck the government. If they get the results they need, they won't need him anymore. So they move straight into human trials, and Sebastian Cain decides that he's the perfect test subject, and he eventually turns himself invisible after a long and painful process. As an invisible person, he then has a lot of fun with his crew. They mess around, joke, and have fun. After that, they attempt to try to make Dr. Cain visible again by injecting him with the same counter serum. However, it fails and he's stuck being invisible. You see, here's where problems start to arise for Dr. Cain. He's invisible, so he's not allowed to leave the compound because he's still technically under testing. But he's stuck being invisible, so he's technically stuck in the compound forever. Now, the rest of the movie is just about Dr. Cain trying to escape the lab, and ultimately, he fails. However, we're going to give him a few tips that could make him successful. Dr. Cain's first escape attempt was actually successful. He simply gets extremely frustrated and angry, gets up and walks past the person that was monitoring him, and basically says, "I'm your boss, fuck you," and gets out the elevator and leaves. Unfortunately for Dr. Cain, when he is outside, he makes a lot of mistakes. For example, after immediately leaving the lab, he starts driving his car and looks at some kids on his left, and he starts showing them his invisible parts, which I absolutely would not do. Even though the risk of you getting caught or someone else seeing it or maybe even recording it is very small, there's no point in taking this risk. After that, let's just say he abuses his invisible powers to abuse some woman, which is definitely not what you want to do. Even though shows sound completely crazy to the police, if any information gets out, you're the only person known to be invisible by the people that work with you. So if someone figures out that an invisible person did something that's really fucked up, they'd instantly know it's you. His lab mates then run to his apartment building, where he forgets to lock the door and also leaves his mask and disguise out in plain sight, meaning they know that he's walking around invisible. Why would you ever do this? If you just lock the door, they wouldn't be able to know that you walked around invisible. After all that, Dr. Cain still decides the best thing to do is return to the lab like nothing happened, and say it's not a big deal. Honestly, if I were Cain in this situation, I'd immediately book a flight to California, book a flight to somewhere nice and warm where I could relax for the rest of my life, because you're invisible, literally no one can even catch you. The next night, Dr. Cain goes out and murders his boss. Well, this was a terrible move. Imagine if there's a security camera at his boss's house watching this entire thing. Since his boss is in a high level of government, they would obviously look into why he died and how he died, and it's unrealistic he just simply drowned in the pool. They'd look at his programs and realize he's working with invisible people and then match that up with the security cameras, and Dr. Cain would be completely fucked. Better solution the Hollowman should have used rather than killing him in plain sight would to be sneak into the boss's house undetected, holding a very small amount of cyanide powder, and then pour it into his morning coffee. This way it would fool the security camera, and the wife would be the only suspect. Dr. Cain also works in a lab, and it just so happens that most labs carry dangerous chemicals such as cyanide. If Dr. Cain had simply done nothing and escaped while he had the chance, the villain would have won this movie, because from here he can literally do whatever he wants. After Dr. Cain finally makes it back to the lab, his crew realize that Dr. Cain has trapped everyone on the top floor of the lab, and he intends to kill them all. The crew then quickly rush out to try to find Dr. Cain, however the black lady forgets her goggles, and as a result she's a straggler and Dr. Cain finds her and strangles her to death. Now let's go over why this was a really good kill from the villain's perspective. Number one, it was quiet. Strangling someone is generally quieter than shooting a gun or swinging an axe at them hundreds of times. However, one big mistake that the Hollowman makes is he had plenty of time to prepare, but he never took away the thermal goggles or the tranquilizer darts. If he did this ahead of time and just took them away and threw them in the trash, then they would have no way of tracking him down or killing him. By the time the crew ends up coming back to look for the black lady, she's already dead, strangled to death. In order to track the Hollowman, the crew gets smarter and they turn on a rat tracking device that tracks movement. Well, this can be easily fooled, since it basically tracks any movement from animals since it was designed to test rats. What you could do is go to the testing animals and release all of them. With them running around, they won't be able to track which one is the Hollowman and which one is not. To continue with the movie, the crew then split up to try to track down Dr. Kane and trap him in a corridor. Unfortunately for the crew, the tracker can only track Dr. Kane when he's moving, so when he stopped moving, the crew sorta lost him. But then they see some heat vents, and they fire their tranquilizer darts at it, thinking it is the Hollowman. However, it's not. Everyone who's played Call of Duty or any sort of shooting game knows that when one of your enemies is reloading, you should immediately rush them if you have bullets. And in this case, the Hollowman has a combat advantage against these other people, since he has the element of surprise. I did some research into tranquilizer pistols, and I found this guy selling a similar model. And it can only hold one round at a time, meaning each time they shoot, they have to reload. So this would be a perfect time for the Hollowman to rush in and try to get a kill. And even if he can't get a kill, he could use one dude's body to block the other tranquilizer dart. The Hollowman is actually a pretty good student because he listens to me and almost gets a kill during this situation. When I say almost, it's because he breaks the dude's neck and he almost dies of blood loss, but he's still barely alive. The Hollowman also does something extremely smart by pumping heat through all the vents, making it so the thermal cameras are almost useless. My question is though, if Dr. Kane had access to the thermostats at all times, why didn't he just do some preparation by pumping the entire lab up to room temperature well ahead of time? This way the thermal cameras would be useless forever. The two end up getting into a fight, but it ends up being a stalemate. Another one of the scientists noticed that Matt, which is the guy that's down, needs a lot of blood since he did lose a lot of blood after all, so she runs to the blood bank and grabs all types of blood she can find. However, she realizes that Kane is near her, so she splashes blood all over the place. Well, this is not hard to beat at all you had to do was walk in this small area that I drew out right here that doesn't have any blood, and you could just go and fucking kill her. However, he doesn't actually do this. I'm okay with his other approach as well, which is he waited for her to leave to go give blood to the other person before attacking her. However, he is a bit reckless and starts taunting her, which results in him getting covered in blood. This is very risky, but it did work out for him. The rest of the scientists then start walking around with fire extinguishers because they realize that the vapor can reveal the invisible man. However, most fire extinguishers only last around 8 to 13 seconds, meaning you could just wait around for them to waste all the vapor and then go attack them. I feel like Dr. Kane could have waited a little bit longer for the fire extinguisher to run out before stabbing him, but he's able to eliminate one person when he's not paying attention with a crowbar. And then he locks the remaining two into a medical freezer and turns the temperature down to bare minimum, basically freezing them both to death. Unfortunately for our favorite villain, the two are able to escape from the medical freezer using a magnet, which they use to open the lever which would open the door. Honestly, you already had one person incapacitated and you also have a weapon. Instead, just beat them to death with a crowbar and leave, and you would have won this movie. Our favorite villain, the Hollowman, then builds a bunch of bombs, deciding to blow up all the lab to hide the evidence. However, what I'm wondering is, what's the point of hiding the evidence? If you're the only one alive, leaving the crime scene with no explanation, they'll obviously know it's you, whether or not they know you're invisible. The Hollowman decides that when he leaves, he wants to put on some clothes, which he does and he gets in the elevator about to leave. However, then he sees the girl scientist running at him with a fucking flamethrower. And let's just say he ends up getting burned really fucking badly. Well, there's two options he could have done to easily avoid this situation. Number one is he could not wear clothes. This way he'd just leave invisible and she wouldn't even be able to see him or know he was in the elevator. Another option is he could have at least dodged the side of the elevator. That way he wouldn't be totally burned and only part of his body would be burned. The invisible dude ends up getting heavily burned. At this point, if I were him and I got away, I would definitely think of how to treat my burns rather than how to escape. Because after all, burns over that much of your body is definitely deadly. Kane then goes to attack the girl scientist. However, in the middle of the attack, the guy scientist ends up saving her. Filled with rage, Kane then goes to swing the crowbar at them, but in exchange he accidentally hits an electrical box, causing him to be electrocuted. However, what I find strange about the situation is since there's water everywhere, shouldn't all three of them get electrocuted since the current will go through the water as well? Anyways, the only advice I could give to him is instead of using a swinging motion, use the stabbing motion that worked earlier. That way you could just stab it through them and kill them. Anyways, the last two scientists then attempt to climb up the elevator shaft to safety. However, Kane is still technically alive and is dragging on one of their foots. The female scientist ends up tricking Kane, who used to date her or something like that, and she says they need to kiss. If I were Kane, I would not be so stupid and fall for this trap. After you killed all her colleagues, how could she possibly still love you? She releases the elevator's emergency lock, and Kane falls to his death and fucking dies. And that's how the movie ends and the villain loses. Overall, I give the Hollowman a villain intelligence score of an 8 out of 10. Although a brilliant scientist who made many intelligent kills, he falls short because his ego is just too big, preventing him from noticing some simple steps he could have took to ensure his victory. I just checked my subscribed people's list, and most of you watching my videos aren't even subscribed, so don't be stingy and drop a subscribe. It's literally free. And as usual, I appreciate all your support. We're up to 14,000 subscribers, which I'm absolutely thankful for, and I appreciate all of you. Make sure to drop a comment on what movie you want next, and as usual, have a good rest of your day. I'm on the move, can't stop me if you try. Coasting on